Welcome to the latest installment of the Overseas Press Club's How I Did It series. I am Patricia Cranz, the Executive Director of the OPC. Today we are delighted to welcome a team of journalists from the Associated Press who won this year's OPC's Malcolm Forbes and Morton Frank Award for their series on global surveillance titled Made in America, Watched Worldwide. The series also won the Pulitzer Prize for international reporting. So congratulations all. That's quite a record. Mary Rajkumar, AP's Global Investigations Editor and a governor of the OPC, will moderate the discussion. The group will explain how they uncovered the cross-border reach of surveillance systems, worked with sensitive sources, and verified complex technical findings under pressure. The panelists are Dake Kang, Garance, Burke, and Byron. Dake is well known to those of us at the OPC. In 2016, he was a winner of an OPC Foundation Scholarship. And this is his second OPC award. He was part of an AP team that won the 2020 OPC Roy Rowan Award for Best Investigative Reporting for a piece called China Cracks Down during the COVID era. Burke is a global investigative journalist with AP based in San Francisco. She focuses on artificial intelligence and government accountability. Byron is an investigative reporter in AP's Washington, D.C. bureau. He focuses on reporting stories about national security, law enforcement, technology, and government accountability. The panel will talk for about half an hour and then take questions. Please put your questions in the chat at any time. Mary will now take over. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. So this project is about how surveillance technology, and I found this horrifying, is reshaping lives in China, but also in dozens of other countries, in Gaza, in the United States, in ways that most of us are not even aware of. And it comes at a critical time because, as we all know, these are now some of the biggest and most powerful companies in the world, and under the Trump administration have only grown more so. So I will cut straight to the chase and enlist our reporters. So first off, I think it might be helpful to say a little bit about how this whole project started. So, Dake, I am going to throw that to you. Can you tell us how you got interested in this, and in particular, how you found out about the pivotal role played by IBM?
Sure. So I have been following and reporting on a crackdown in China's far west Xinjiang region since I came to China in 2018. Basically, there was a mass detention campaign where the Chinese government rounded up hundreds of thousands, if not over a million, Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities in the region. And they were using a lot of technology to do it. And at the time, it was very poorly understood. But we were getting a sense of what was going on from people who were trickling out of the region and telling really bizarre stories at the time. To us when we would visit places like Kazakhstan to get access to those people. And they would say things like, oh, for example, I remember very vividly interviewing someone who was whose brother or whose sister was detained in Xinjiang. And she said something along the lines of, I heard that their score was too low. So they were flagged as being suspicious and detained. And I was like, what on earth does that mean? Like your score is too low? Now obviously we've written the whole series and we've basically figured out what was going on. But at the time, it was really like, oh, this is 1984 in the flesh, right? I mean, it was just so bizarre. And it just planted this seed in my head for a long time. It was something that I really wanted to get to the bottom of. And, you'd have pieces come out, but it wasn't entirely clear what the full story was necessarily. And then a few years ago, freelance journalist Yael Grauer approached me. She was introduced to me by a mutual source of ours with a massive cache of documents that illustrated some of what was going on because it was actually the contractor that had built the system for the Xinjiang authorities. I pounced on the opportunity to figure out what was going on. We went through the documents together, and that's when we realized that a lot of these signs pointed towards IBM because these documents came from a security contractor that was a former IBM partner. So then we started digging into the role that IBM played, and that led me to more sources. And then I got a second cache of internal documents that revealed that IBM had actually been quite pivotal in constructing China's surveillance apparatus from the very beginning, way back decades ago, along with a slew of other American companies. So that's kind of how this all started.
Got it. I think I would say that two of the most surprising things in this project that we found was how Silicon Valley didn't just play a role here, they largely designed and built China's whole tech surveillance system. And B, that Silicon Valley has in the past said, well, we can't help how our technology is used. And we showed that they actually had a very good idea of how the technology was going to be used, and in some cases marketed it specifically to be used to distinguish Uyghurs from Han Chinese, etc. And we also found that that was really just the start of the story. China has since exported that technology for authoritarian purposes to dozens of countries. And Silicon Valley also is using the same technology in Gaza to decide essentially who gets killed. And horrifyingly, back in the United States on US citizens. So, Byron, let me throw that part to you. Um, you and Garance worked on a story about how the US Border Patrol is now using surveillance technology on not just on immigrants, but also on US citizens far from the border. Can you talk a little bit about how the origins of that piece of it, how that came out of it?
Sure. So I think, if I'm remembering correctly, you kind of came to us with the question of, well, how is this kind of technology that we're seeing being used in China and Nepal and in Gaza, how's that being applied in the United States? And immigration was certainly one of the hot topics as the Trump administration took over. So Grant and I, and this was truly a team effort, spent a lot of time sort of in the early stages of just reading and prospecting. So at one point, we went to a bunch of courthouses in the Washington and San Francisco areas and enlisted some colleagues down in the Southeast to look at these court petitions that described immigrants and being arrested to see if there was any indication of what technologies were being used there. Then we started looking kind of at the DHS policy documents, like what technologies does this agency describe using on the American populace? And one thing about DHS is that when it was set up after 9/11, it did have a very strong privacy component. Congress mandated that it have a privacy office and that privacy office publish a great deal of information about its technologies and how they're being used. So we read a lot of those policy documents. And then we started calling around. We started calling around to lawyers who worked on immigration cases. We started talking to the defense bar, and we started reading court documents. And one of the things, I'm sort of an obsessive collector of tips, even as I go about reporting other stories. And one of the things that a lawyer had told me a very long time ago when I was working on something very different was that, down in the border region, most reporters in New York or Washington or San Francisco don't really have any idea of how this area is policed. Um, so, that kind of theme stuck in my head. Like, what's happening in this border region, in this big zone, especially along the southern border, but also along the northern border. The other thing is, I just remembered this case in San Antonio, Texas, of just a random motorist who was stopped. He had his car torn apart for no discernible reason. And so, I just kind of remembering these two things, I just started reading that case and a bunch of other court cases down in the Texas and California and Arizona area. And in a couple of those documents, but notably in this case in San Antonio, as you started reading through these thousands of pages of of court documents, which included testimony, which included text messages, you started to see how the border region was policed. You started to see that the Border Patrol was actually a big presence, had to have deep relationships with law enforcement in Texas and in Arizona and in California, that they were passing tips back and forth about motorists that they considered suspicious. And so this was kind of the start of unwinding this program, and a lot else went into it. I can let Garance talk about other parts of the reporting. That was kind of the genesis of us starting to dig into exactly what was happening inside the United States and getting the sense that it wasn't just traditional policing of looking for a known suspect, that they were doing something that looked a little bit like what was happening in more authoritarian countries, like looking at people's behavior and singling them out with sort of a risk score or a behavioral pattern that indicated suspicion, and then finding a reason to pull them over.
So, Garance, I'll throw it to you to say a little bit more about the many methods we use to find documentation on this. But also, I wanted to talk about sourcing. Garance, you cover AI for the AP, and one of the challenges with AI is that it can be quite a technical subject. So, would you also talk about how we found human sources to humanize this technology story? So, Garance, over to you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. So I think that one of the challenges is that these technologies really are quite complicated. And so we all wanted to make sure that our reporting was just very detailed and nuanced and accurate, whether we were writing about the hardware that was used, say, for example, in the Border Patrol story, these automated license plate cameras, which, essentially we found are like hidden in traffic cones around Arizona, or whether it was a very complicated AI models that were being used to help guide bombing decisions in Gaza. And so we consulted a lot of different experts who helped us really parse the difference between the hardware and the software and how those things interacted. And we also employed some different kinds of records requests in order to get at this. So, for example, with the Border Patrol story, we had heard that the Border Patrol had to ask state agencies for permission to place its automated license plate readers on state-owned land. And so we went after that at the state level. And that ultimately gave us this really granular view of where these cameras were. And we were able to send out a photographer to get photos of them. Um, but I think in all of this, of course, as you mentioned, Mary, knowing about the technology and its inner workings is not enough. You need human sources. And in the Israel story, of course, in China and here in the United States, we really wanted to make sure that our sources were comfortable talking with us. So often this involved, combing through LinkedIn to find former officials, relying really on word of mouth and the trust of, longtime sources we all had who had been in and out of government and in and out of technology companies to guide us to people with actual knowledge of how these systems worked. And then, of course, we can get into this later, but crucially, we wanted to make sure that we could tell narrative visual stories that focused on the people impacted. So, Uyghur people in China who had faced these kinds of surveillance systems and been imprisoned, people in Lebanon who had actually undergone one of these bombing campaigns. And in the Border Patrol story, people who had been pulled over, as you mentioned, Byron, as a result of this algorithm deciding that they were suspicious.
And Garance, I think some of the people you tracked down were more willing to talk because they were out of the country. Is that right?
Yeah,
They were
that
no
was a
longer in the
surprising
US.
piece of this. Yes, absolutely. I think that,
Mhm.
under this particular environment, we've all been thinking very creatively about how to talk to sources in a way that's comfortable for them. And in this case, it sort of involved thinking about the United States as a foreign correspondent. So finding people who were outside of the US who were therefore more comfortable talking about what had happened to them here because they had already undergone sort of, the worst of their fears, right? And so, for example, this particular man, Luis Barrios, who had been pulled over while he was actually he was not pulled over. His colleague was pulled over as a result of this Border Patrol um, technology, was much more comfortable talking about his colleague's experience since he was already in Mexico. And so I think that that really forced us to think creatively about how to find people in ways where they felt safe talking. I know you thought a lot about that as well, Dake.